So we're very pleased and very proud tonight to be able to have Cathy Sherry from the law school being able to give us some insights into her educational practice. And I'll give you a little bit of a background on Cathy. Many of you here are obviously Cathy's family, friends, colleagues, but there'll be others here who may not know all that about Cathy's background. In terms of her research, she's very well known in terms of her research into social implications of private communities, the optimal planning for children in those communities. Cathy actually has a special interest as well in urban farming and the challenges of providing growing space in high-density cities. That's actually obviously something important for all of us in that area. So Cathy, thank you for your research work as well. But also, Cathy has been awarded a number of special awards for her teaching. She's received the Vice-Chancellor's Award for Teaching Excellence, so this is the highest award within UNSW. It's a mark of merit for our esteemed educators. But not only has she received awards within the university, she's received awards outside the university in terms of recognition of her excellence in teaching as well. She's received the New South Wales Department of Training and Education Educators Award, the Australian College of Educators Award. She was the winner of the individual category for Legal Innovation Index 2001, which is her online Moodle site for land law. And just recently, we understand, Cathy last week was also the Academic of the Year for the Lawyers Weekly Women in Law Awards. So Cathy, not only have you been recognised inside the university, but importantly for you individually, but for the university as well, you've been recognised outside the university. So we are very fortunate tonight to be able to hear some of the insights from one of our esteemed educators. So Cathy is going to, as you can see from the title up here, I love the title, Cathy, Great Teaching, that indefinable, indescribable, yet identifiable thing. So Cathy, please come and deliver your lecture.
Hi, thank you everyone for coming. I don't actually often get nervous speaking in front of people, but I will admit that I am nervous now. So my talk tonight is that great teaching, that indefinable, indescribable, but identifiable thing. I wanted to start, I'll just see if this clicker working, maybe not, maybe if I turn it around the right way. Because I'm a land lawyer and I spent a lot of time thinking about land, I just wanted to do an acknowledgement of country, and we are meeting on the traditional land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I would like to pay my particular respects to elders past and present, as well as any Indigenous people here tonight. So, moving on to the presentation, before I start talking about great teaching, I want to say a few things about good teaching, because I think to a large extent that good teaching is describable and it is definable. And there are multiple elements that we could identify, and I'm just going to pick out a few. Some of these might actually sound very obvious, but unfortunately it is the case that some teachers, sometimes through lack of experience, but sometimes actually through lack of care, fail to do these things with really poor results for students. It can make for a very frustrating educational experience for students. And like my colleague Richard Buckland, who gave a great Scientia lecture, talked about talking to other students, I often talk to students here at other universities, and sometimes I'm a bit shocked and surprised by some of the things I hear. So I just wanted to talk about some basic things that make for good teaching, and like I said, some of them are really obvious, like being organised. So coming to class, knowing the material you're going to cover and moving through it in a logical and orderly fashion. Providing students with clear information, so clear course outlines, setting out what a course is going to be about, what students have to read, when they have to read it, what the assessment is, when it's due, how it's going to be assessed. I don't think that students should be told things like course learning outcomes, because I don't think they read them, because I don't think they understand them. I think it's really important to provide students with clear and meaningful information that they can use. And it's that kind of nuts and bolts stuff about courses. I think it's really important to know who your students are. It's a really important part of teaching, so that you start at the right point. And I think in recent years, increasingly, because of the emphasis on research in research in universities, we have seen more and more what I would describe as conversations with colleagues masquerading as teaching. So there's anyone who works in a university knows that there's an enormous amount of pressure to research, to publish, to get research grants. And I think logically a lot of staff try to rationalise their workload by teaching what they research. Now, very often that will be entirely appropriate. We should be teaching what we research, but sometimes it won't be, because sometimes what we research is far too complicated for undergraduates, and by presenting undergraduates with that information, not only do they not understand its detail, but they actually fail to understand the basics, because we've just given them far too much information and a lot of it is too complicated. So I think it's really important to think about who your students are and start from a point where they're at, not where your colleagues or your peers at other universities might be. So I teach land law, and I predominantly teach it to 20-year-olds. It goes without saying that most people in my classroom have never so much as bought a house, let alone had a mortgage. So when I'm teaching mortgages, I have to start at the very beginning, and that's saying things to students like, we talk about banks giving us mortgages. It's not actually right. Banks give us money and we give the bank a mortgage, which is a little interest in land that entitles them to sell the house out from under us in the event that we don't repay the money that we borrowed. So that's very, very basic, but it's important for 20-year-olds before you get into complex mortgage law. In recent years, many of us have taught a lot of Chinese international students. China's a communist state. All land is owned by the state, and people typically have 75-year land use rights. That's how property development's done in China, for example. So when I'm teaching Chinese international students, I need to start with some of the basics. So what does property ownership mean, private property ownership mean in a liberal capitalist democracy? I can't assume that my international students understand that in a way that domestic students would. And so it's really important to start at the same point your students are at. I think it's really important to stay up to date with teaching. And again, one of those obvious things, but I look back on my teaching at university and I'm pretty confident I was taught by some people who were using the same lecture notes they'd been using for 30 or 40 years. And that was a problem, even if they were teaching Shakespeare. I think that it is important to be open to the potential of technology in teaching, and I don't think that technology should be central to all courses. I think there are a lot of courses that will still always only be able to be taught well by small groups of people meeting in rooms in person and discussing things. But I think technology has potential for all courses in the same way as it does for everything else we do in life. So university administration, research, none of us think, oh, well, I won't bother sending an email, I'll just get out my carrier pigeon. We use technology, and similarly, none of us wants to go downstairs to the library and physically photocopy hard copies of journals. We look it up online and we hit print. So in terms of teaching and technology, even the most basic thing like clear course outlines, make sure that they're online, on a central online repository that students can find, not handed out on pieces of paper that a student maybe never got, can't find you to get another one. So just considering the potential of technology, I think, is important. Now, there are lots of other attributes of good teaching I can talk about, and the Scientia Academy Fellows actually have a research grant called Dimensions of Effective Teaching Practice in Higher Education, and it's a CEF grant. I'm not going to take any credit for this because almost all the work has been done by Professor Gary Velan in the Faculty of Medicine. But the idea is that we're going to ask good and experienced teachers what they think are the elements of good teaching. And that's important for people who want to be promoted on the basis of teaching. But I also think that it's important so that universities can mandate certain elements of good teaching. And I'm pretty confident that I've sent a shiver down the spine of every academic in the room when I just said that word mandate, because there's nothing that we hate more than being told to do things by central university administration, myself included. We find it very irritating, but not nearly as irritating as it is for students when they don't get things like clear course outlines, or they experience, some of the things I've heard from students are things like rubrics changing weeks after students have been given an assessment and have started working on it. So that kind of thing is very frustrating for students and really undermines their educational experience. So I think some of those basic things universities should actually insist on, because while 90% of staff will do it, there's a percentage of staff who won't, just because maybe they don't realise they're being careless, or sometimes because they actually don't care. Okay, so I think all of these things are necessary for good teaching, or probably not all of them, but it would be a good idea if we did them to do good teaching. But I don't think actually any of them is sufficient for great teaching. And what do I mean by great teaching? Well, I'm going to show you what I consider to be great teaching on the following slide. And it's the teaching assessments of a sessional colleague of mine. And for people who aren't in the university sector, just an explanation of those two terms, sessional staff are staff who are employed on a semester-to-semester basis. So very, very large amounts of teaching in universities these days are done by casual members of staff who are employed for, say, 12 weeks at a time, perhaps only 8 hours a week. So that's what I mean by sessional staff. What do I mean by teaching assessments? Well, all tertiary institutions every year or every semester, it varies, survey their students about their experience of both teaching and courses. Now, these surveys are done, they used to be done in hard copy, they're usually done online now. Students are asked a whole range of questions about things, and the surveys usually culminate in a final question or statement, usually that says something like, overall, I was satisfied with this course, or overall, I was satisfied with this teacher's teaching. And what staff get is a percentage score, and that percentage represents the number of students who have said strongly agree or agree to that statement. Okay, so that's teaching assessments. They're also anonymous, absolutely anonymous. In 25 years, I've never had any idea who's filled them in. So this is what I mean by great teaching. There's a lot of contention about student surveys, and I'll address that too in this presentation, but for the moment I just want to show you these. So I'm less interested in the course scores, because very often sessional staff are teaching other people's courses and they don't have any control over the content of the course. I'm more interested in the teaching scores, so the lecturer scores, and convener means they also organise the course. And as you will see, they range from a score of 100% of students have said agree or strongly agree to the statement, overall I was satisfied with this teacher's teaching, down to an abysmal low of 97% of students. So these are what I would call very, very good teaching assessments. I need to stress that I haven't picked a colleague who is some kind of weird, aberrant outlier. What you'll see up there is Law's mean, which is 93.5. I couldn't get the median, but we're a big faculty, so mean is probably relatively accurate. So she's certainly at the top of the tree, but she's not some kind of particularly aberrant outlier. There's a lot of very good teaching that goes on in universities. And I need to say that this is for a range of courses, of classes, so ranging in size from, say, 20 students up to about 100 students. And I know for the people in the room who teach science or medicine or engineering, 100 is tiny. They're very often teaching in groups of up to 1,000. But I think it's important to note that it is a real variety. So it is very different teaching 20 students to teaching 100 students. It's quite a different skill. Despite the variation in class sizes, my colleagues' results are absolutely consistent. Semester to semester, year after year, she gets almost exactly the same results. Now, how does she do this? Well, I don't think that it actually has a lot to do with course outlines or learning outcomes. I think that when you ask students whether they were satisfied overall with this teacher's teaching, what they are thinking about is what most people would define as teaching. And it's this: the ability to hold people's attention and to communicate complex information in a way that students can understand. So that ability to make the penny drop, to move from a state of confusion or uncertainty to a point of clarity, or as we'd say in colloquial terms, helping students get it. Now, I think we've all experienced this, and it's the core element of great teaching. We've all probably had some experience. We've probably all had that experience of reading something on our own and not understanding it, reading it again and still not understanding it, if we're feeling very conscientious, reading it a third time and maybe still not understanding it. But then we go to work or we go to university and we ask a teacher or we ask a colleague, say, look, I don't get this, can you explain it to me? And they say, well, it's this, this and this, and then there's this bit here, and then you add that and then you get this. And you go, oh, I get it, the penny drops and you understand it. That is teaching. And great teaching is being able to do that class after class, semester after semester, year after year. And it's why we bother to have universities at all. Because most people will never be able to understand as much reading on their own as they will be able to understand when they read on their own, but somebody explains the complex concepts they couldn't understand on their own for them. That will get them to a higher level of understanding. Okay, so having said in the title to my talk that great teaching is indescribable and not definable, I've just attempted to both describe and define it. But this is a very broad brushstroke attempt. I suspect a psychologist could watch a great teacher teach and break down what they're doing into constituent parts and describe what they're doing. They're doing this and they're doing this and they're doing this. But even if they can describe it, that does not mean that you can teach somebody else to do it, because good teachers and great teachers have not learned to do what they are doing. They haven't practiced at home, they haven't broken down their explanations into separate parts and practiced in the bedroom or in the bathroom in front of the mirror. They do it instinctively. To a very, very large degree, a teaching ability is innate. It can't be taught and it cannot be mandated by institutions. Now, like my colleague Richard Buckland said in his Scientia Academy lecture, I believe that everyone can teach. I actually think it's an innate human ability, and it's probably to do with the fact that we have young and we have to teach them so that they reach adulthood alive. But I think, like most things in life, our ability to teach falls on a spectrum. Some people will really excel in that regard, like my colleague whose teaching results I put up before, and some people will really struggle. The key for universities and other teaching institutions is to make sure that the people that they employ fall towards that end of the spectrum, towards the good to great end of the spectrum, and don't actually represent the spectrum as it exists in the general population. So it's fine for the general population to have a spectrum of teaching like that, but to the greatest degree possible, and it won't always be possible, but to the greatest degree possible, teaching institutions should be employing people who fall on that end of the spectrum. Now, I don't think that universities have always done this, because they have traditionally made us all teach and all do research, and I think that that's become more problematic in recent years with the increased emphasis on research. Academia is actually a deeply schizophrenic profession in that it involves two very, very different skills. One is sitting in a room by yourself with books, and the other is standing up in front of a group of people and talking. And they're very different skill sets. Most academics can actually do both. However, some people will really struggle with one or the other, and some people will actually excel at both. But as I said, we have traditionally expected people to do both. Now, this produces a number of problems, but I'm going to focus on one. One is the fact that teaching is deeply, deeply personal. When you stand up in front of a group of people and you do something and you do a presentation and they say that they don't like what you have done, it is very upsetting. And we've all had that experience of getting student assessments and somebody said, oh, it was awful, I hated this, or there's someone who said strongly disagree to everything. You're like, who is that kid? What did I do to upset them? I tried so hard. You know, how could they say that about me? That is so mean. And at the risk of sounding like a pop psychologist, the easiest way to deal with criticism is to deny its validity. So if you feel hurt by criticism, the easiest way to protect yourself is to say, well, that criticism isn't valid. Students don't know what they're talking about anyway. They don't know what's good for them. They've got no idea. So it doesn't really matter what they say because they don't know what they're talking about. There are a few problems with this as far as I'm concerned. And the first is that whatever the flaws in student surveys, and there are definitely flaws, there's no doubt I concede that there are definitely flaws in student surveys. However, one flaw is not that students can't judge good teaching. And I think that if we look back on our own experience of teaching when we were at university or when we were at school, if we think about the experience we had, do we seriously think that we were not able to judge whether we were being taught well? So if you look back on courses you did at university where you thought, oh, they were fantastic, the lecturer was unreal, you understood everything, it was really clear, you wanted to go to every class, you really felt like you were learning, do you really think you're not capable of judging that? And conversely, those classes that we absolutely hated, and we went as much as we could force ourselves to, and it was disorganised and we didn't understand things and it didn't matter what people asked the lecturer, they couldn't seem to explain things in a way that people understood, and we didn't really feel like we were learning a lot, do we really think that our judgment is flawed? Or is it possible that we actually do know what we're talking about when we make those judgments? Now, I think there might be circumstances where we look back and we might have had a teacher who was a bit mean or a bit hard. And in retrospect, when we're older, we go, oh, well, okay, I can concede. They were a bit mean and nasty, but I did learn a lot. But I would suggest that those experiences are very few and far between, and they are very unusual after about the age of 16. Because university students, as a general rule, do not want pats on the head and gold stars. They want to be taught well. They don't need us to be their friend. They don't need us to be their parent. Some of them probably do, but that's not generally what most university students want. They want to be taught well. And if you gave a university student a choice between a teacher who was really nice and kind and a teacher who could stand up the front and really clearly explain some complex thing in engineering, chemistry or law, they will take the latter every day of the week, because that's what they want from us. They want us to be able to teach well. They want to be able to understand, and students are best placed to actually know whether they are understanding when they're being taught. Now, one of the things that I've heard over the years in academia is the idea that student surveys are popularity polls, or they reward spoon-feeding teachers. Now, I'm not sure that there's any rigorous research that supports this. I've actually looked for it and I couldn't find it. I think the popularity poll thing is weird because it's quite likely that lecturers are popular because they're good at teaching, they're good at their job. It's very unlikely we're popular because of our sense of dress or our taste in music. It's much more likely that we're popular, or people might be popular, because they're good at their job. The spoon-feeding argument that you often hear, I've always doubted as well, and I'm going to give you a piece of anecdotal evidence because I couldn't find any research that actually supported this thing that you often hear people say. It's anecdotal evidence from my own teaching, and I apologise it's anecdotal evidence, but I've been teaching for 25 years and I've taught close to somewhere between 2,000 to 3,000 students, so it's a relatively large anecdotal sample. The example I'm going to give you is this. I have never in 25 years written a PowerPoint slide for my large compulsory course, never. I don't write PowerPoint slides because I think it's hard enough for students to listen, write and participate without adding reading to it. I just think it's too difficult for them. I also don't do PowerPoint slides because I'm a mean, nasty old cow, and I don't think that it is my job to summarise the reading for students. They know very clearly what they're meant to read, and it's their job to summarise it, not mine. So I've never given PowerPoint slides. Now, many of my colleagues, and sorry, I should also say that, of course, as far as I'm concerned, it's the process of making notes that makes students learn, not having somebody else's notes. So it's not just because I'm mean, it's because I think they learn better when they make their own notes. Now, many of my colleagues do use PowerPoint slides, and I don't mean to condemn PowerPoint slides as a form of teaching. I think it's incredibly important that people are allowed to teach in their own classroom the way they want to teach. Everybody teaches better from a position of conviction. People will teach badly if they're made to teach in a way they don't agree with. So I have no problem with people teaching with PowerPoint slides. I only mention it for this reason. My students are aware that week after week after week, other classes in exactly the same course are getting PowerPoint summaries for every single class, and they are not. And yet in 25 years, I have never once had a student complain. So I'm very sceptical about the idea that student surveys reward spoon feeding. In my experience, students don't care how they're taught and they don't care how they're assessed, as long as it is done well. And I'll give you another very quick example, and that is that we introduced a closed book exam for the first time in the law school's history last year. Never done. All of our exams are open book. Pretty obvious students would rather do an open book exam. And I won't talk about why we did it, but if people are interested in questions, I'll answer questions about it. But we did it. It did not make one iota of difference to my student assessments or to our course assessments, which were actually substantially better than most courses that had open book exams. So I don't think students care about it being easy. That's not what they're interested in. They're interested in being taught well and being assessed well. The second reason that I have very serious reservations about people rejecting student assessments, and it's very, very common in the culture of universities, you quite frequently hear it, is that it seems to me to be astonishingly disrespectful to colleagues like my sessional colleague who has really outstanding teaching results. Those results are not a popularity poll and they are not a reward for spoon feeding. They are a result of skill, very serious professional skill that deserves to be recognised and it deserves to be rewarded. And the problem with rejecting student surveys is if we say bad surveys don't matter, then conversely, good or even great surveys don't matter either. You can't kind of have it both ways. Okay, so if bad ones don't matter, good ones don't matter either. And for most of my time being an academic, that has been the case at universities. Good surveys don't matter. So it will no doubt come as a surprise to people who don't work in the university sector, but those results that I put up before, which I'm sure you can remember, the 100%, it's not hard to remember, Before the introduction of education-focused roles this year, and I'm going to diverge slightly for people who are not academics at UNSW, UNSW this year has taken, I think, the very brave and admirable step of introducing education-focused roles, which means that people can be full-time permanent academics and focus on education rather than research. It's been on the cards in academia for decades, very contentious. UNSW has bitten the bullet, so to speak, and introduced them, and I think that's a very good thing. So going back to what I was saying, prior to the introduction of education-focused roles, those really outstanding teaching results of my colleague would have meant absolutely nothing beyond slightly increasing her chance of getting another 12 weeks casual work for 8 hours a week. There is no possibility that she would get a permanent job as an academic, despite the fact that she is, I think, clearly doing a sizable part of an academic's job better than 99% of people in this institution. And I don't mean any disrespect to my colleagues here, they're amazing teachers here, but not everyone is getting results of 97 to 100% in student assessments. So it would not get her a permanent job. Even as a permanent academic, those assessments would not really be particularly significant. It is true that you can be promoted on teaching track, but student assessments are just a very small part of the picture, and they are substantially diluted by other criteria, like writing curricula, doing research on teaching and learning, and receiving teaching awards. Now, it's not to say that writing curricula or doing research on teaching and learning is not important, it is. The only problem is it's not the actual act of teaching. It's not standing in a classroom with students. So I'm rewriting curricula at the moment and I love it. At the risk of exposing myself as a terrible nerd, I'm having so much fun. I love doing it. But I could write a really good curriculum and be absolutely hopeless at teaching it to students. They are simply not the same activity. And the same goes for researching, teaching and learning. Researching, teaching and learning is incredibly valuable, but it is just as much research as researching astrophysics or strata title, which is what I do. It is not the act of teaching. And I think it's really important for universities to be much clearer about what the actual act of teaching is and to reward that activity. So, I'm just going to summarising this section just quickly. I'm saying that student assessments have flaws, there's no doubt about that. But they are not popularity polls, they don't reward spoon feeding, they assess and they actually identify that really difficult to define thing, great teaching. And by dismissing student assessments, as we frequently do in universities, we are dismissing good and great student assessments, and as a result we are dismissing good and great teaching. And we are pushing universities back towards that centre of that spectrum that I showed before, which is fine if it's the general public, but it's not fine if it's a teaching institution. We should be pushing our staff to make sure that the staff that we employ are on the upper end of that spectrum. Now, I want to talk briefly about research. And in particular, the mantra that used to be really common in universities, that you cannot teach well unless you do research. It's not as common anymore. I haven't heard it as much recently, which I think is a very good thing, but it used to be very common. And the reason why I want to mention it is firstly just to say that I've always thought it was rubbish, sorry, just to call a spade a spade. And I think it is an example of why it is really important to challenge orthodoxies in universities, because there are certain things that someone says once, people start to repeat it, it gets said again and again and again, and privately people are thinking, I don't really agree with that, but no one will actually say, oops, no, that's not the slide I wanted. No one will actually say the emperor has no clothes. It's just not true. And I think that idea that you can't teach well unless you do research is one of those things that people need to say the emperor has no clothes. Now, I don't want to sound like I don't value research. I do. I value research greatly and I do quite a lot of it. I also know that my research is important for my teaching, but only in very limited ways. So, this is my book, which is, I was going to show before, very exciting. It's a drama and suspense-filled romp through Australian and international strata title law. It's very, very exciting stuff. Now, it's important to my teaching, but, and it's important in this way, it is the difference between me being able to teach the law that relates to that and me being able to teach the law that relates to that. You might recognise that Central Park, which is the lovely plant-covered building opposite UTS. So it matters that I do research because I understand the legal structure for that. So my research is on the very complicated legal, social, political and economic relationships that are created by complex property titles in large multi-owned developments, and that's what that is. But I think it is very important to recognise the difference between correlation and causation when it comes to research and teaching. And I hope that I'm going to do my lovely colleague Louise Lutzy-Mann proud as I say this, because in her Scientia lecture, she talked about the importance of students in science education, or students generally, everyone, understanding the difference between correlation and causation. Now, what I'm about to talk about is not scientific in any way, shape or form, but I think the point is still relevant to teaching. So while there is a correlation between me researching complex property titles and our undergraduates and postgraduates learning about them, my research does not cause me to teach this well. It's entirely possible that I could research and write about strata title and not be able to communicate my research clearly to students at all. It's entirely possible that another teacher who hasn't done the research at all will be able to communicate it better than me, either because they're a better teacher or possibly precisely because they have not done the research. That is, having been in that position where they don't understand something and now they understand it, they are better able to help students make that change as well. And it may be possible that, unlike me, it may be that because I have been up to my eyeballs in strata title law for years, I can't remember or even imagine what it's like not to be able to understand that complex law. And I think we've all been taught by academics who are, without a doubt, experts in their field, but for some reason they cannot communicate their knowledge in bite-sized, digestible chunks for other people to understand. So, in other words, while there might be a correlation between research and the content of courses, there is no causation between research and teaching well. And it goes without saying, most of us, are, even if we do research, are always, almost 99% of the time, teaching outside our area of expertise. So I only teach strata title very rarely, maybe for one class. The rest of the time I'm teaching things like mortgages, native title, co-ownership. I've never done any research in those areas at all. But it doesn't mean I can't teach them, because I'm teaching undergraduates. They don't need a complex explanation of really difficult mortgage law. Okay, so moving on to conclude this talk, because I want to leave time for questions, I want to emphasise one thing, and that is that while I think that student assessments accurately judge good teaching, and they should be given much, much greater credence than they currently are in universities, I have absolutely no desire for anyone to be named and shamed in relation to teaching assessments if they struggle with teaching. That would be an appalling thing to do on an individual level and a very destructive thing to do on an institutional level. Because just as nobody learns through fear, and any good teacher will tell you that, nobody does their job well if they are scared. And so I would never like to see that happen. However, I do think that some of us probably need to toughen up when it comes to other people's teaching assessments. Now, I have a lovely colleague down the corridor from me called Ross Buckley, and I don't mention Ross's name because I think he needs to toughen up. All 6'1" of Ross does not need to toughen up. He's fine as he is. I mention Ross because Ross is a very prolific researcher, like many of my colleagues in the law faculty. There's amazing researchers in the law faculty. Ross is a very prolific researcher, and he is the recipient of millions of dollars of research grants. Ross is not required to hide his research light under a bushel, so I don't feel bad about myself and the fact that I have modest research funding in comparison to Ross. Ross doesn't have to pretend that he isn't an outstanding researcher, nor does he have to anonymise his achievements for my benefit. His achievements are out and proud on his staff homepage and on the university homepage, as they should be. Anything else would be absurd. It's his work and it's his achievement, and he deserves credit for it. However, I can't tell you the name of my colleague who got those outstanding teaching assessments. I can't tell you because clause 27E of our enterprise bargain says course evaluation data will not be published in a form that identifies individual staff members beyond relevant line management and students involved in the course. Now, I know that that is there to protect some staff from being named and shamed by student assessments, some of which may be completely invalid. So I know that it's there for a reason. However, the result is that staff who are actually rated outstandingly by students can't be identified either. Now, it's the case that, of course, people can be open about things like teaching awards, but as the recipient of a number of teaching awards that Jeff mentioned, I am very sceptical about teaching awards. I'm sceptical about teaching awards because a large amount of what goes into teaching awards is people saying that they are good teachers. That's what you do when you apply for teaching awards. You describe what you do. Now, as a lawyer, we would call that self-serving evidence. I don't think someone is a great teacher because they say they're a great teacher. I think someone's a great teacher because students say they are a great teacher. And yet that only forms part of teaching awards. It's an important part of teaching awards, but it's still only part of teaching awards, in the same way that it's only part of promotion on the basis of teaching. So, I think that universities need to seriously rethink the secret nature of teaching assessments, not so that people who struggle with teaching can be named and shamed, but so that people who teach well can get appropriate professional credit and reward, and so that all staff in faculties and universities can have an accurate understanding about the standard of teaching that can actually be attained in a classroom. Because most academics, myself included, because I have never been a head of school and I have never been a dean, have no idea how their teaching measures up to other colleagues because they've never seen anyone else's teaching assessments. I only saw that colleague's teaching assessments by chance in relation to something I was doing, and I asked her if I could use them. Other than that, I've never seen my colleagues' teaching assessments as a general rule. We are largely in the dark about a huge amount of work that's going on around us, and I think that that is a very peculiar state of affairs, and it is not conducive to universities rewarding and valuing teaching. So, in conclusion, I want to say that although good teaching can be described and it can be defined, great teaching is very much more elusive. It's very difficult to describe what a great teacher is doing when they hold people's attention and they provide clear explanations of complex ideas, class after class, semester after semester, year after year. However, although great teaching is very hard to describe, it is not difficult to identify. Our students are doing it every single day in our classrooms, and if universities are going to improve teaching and ensure that students experience a lot more very good and truly great teaching, we need to listen a lot more carefully to what students are saying. Thank you.
Firstly, congratulations, Cathy, on your first lecture with the PowerPoint.
Yeah, but look,
I think you did a really good job. Yeah, no, I think you did a really good job, and you know the words are big enough we can all read them. So well done. I just want to ask. I remember when student assessments went from paper-based, where I used to get 70 and 80% response rate, and then as soon as it went online, we all said, you're going to get about 15%. And sure enough, that's what happened. And we've now moved to my experience, and we've got it all on devices and stuff, and I'm not quite sure what the numbers are yet, but do you want to talk about that a little bit? And
yeah, absolutely. I think,
that?
having read an email from our head of school at the moment, we're tracking at about, I think, 37% in the university at this point in time in responses. And that's one of the very obvious flaws in student surveys that people quite rightly point to. So if only 20% of students answer, it's obviously a distorted perception of students' views of teaching. And it's right that going online has reduced that. I mean, what we try to do in the law school is we make people do it in class, and we get relatively high responses. So we actually carve out time in class and say to students, can you please do it now? But that's definitely one of the clear flaws of student surveys if you don't get sufficient response. But like I said, making students do it in class, I think, is a good idea.
Yep. Hi, Cathy. Well done. So just sort of relating back to that other question of yours, Graham. So there are ways to increase participation rates, and our faculty's done that very successfully. So I'll share something with you. Cathy, the idea of publicising the scores that you mentioned. So you mentioned the EBA and things like this. There's nothing stopping your colleague from advertising them. No,
I realise
right?
that.
So that got me thinking. Why aren't we doing this? Why aren't we publicising our own scores.
Well, I'll tell you something, I do, and I also am completely aware, I have them on my faculty webpage, and I am completely aware that a lot of people probably think that that's showing off. I know that that's what people think about teaching assessments, and I find that also part of the really peculiar culture about teaching. No one thinks it's showing off to put your research grants on your faculty homepage, and I do it on principle because I think it's actually a really important thing that we need to be much more transparent about. And like I said, not for the purposes of naming and shaming, but it is bizarre, and it doesn't happen in institutions overseas. It is bizarre that we are very clear about research gains, but we aren't about teaching. And can I say this quickly? I was going to include this. I often think that teaching and research is a little bit like profit and loss in the GFC. So one of them is privatised and one of them is socialised. So in the GFC, before the GFC, profit was very clearly privatised. Investment banks took a lot of it home. And come the GFC, losses were socialised. They were bailed out by the general public. And I think that that happens with teaching and research. So research is very much privatised. There's no doubt we all benefit from working in an institution with wonderful researchers, so it's socialised to an extent. But we're very clear about who does what research. You know, anything else would just be laughable. We wouldn't dream of it. But when it comes to teaching, all we ever see are these generalised scores for faculties and for universities, with no acknowledgement of the fact that there are certain people, like my colleague with her 100% scores, who are very much more responsible for those overall means than other people. And I think that that's really weird, that somehow it's this just amorphous score that we all got. It's not. It's actually specific to the job that we are all doing. So yes, we can publicise it, but I know what the culture is and the perception of publicising those things, but I don't think it should simply be up to individual staff.
Yeah, and certainly overseas, in places like the US, it's more normal to have these openness of course evaluations and rate my teacher and all that sort of stuff. And the science faculty has done that with its courses 3 years ago. So again, I'm happy to share with you, what we've learned and things like that.
So shared your course or teaching ones?
Course, not teaching.
I wonder. I don't know. I read the enterprise agreement and it seems to clearly say you're not meant to, but whatever. No, maybe I'm wrong about that.
We navigated that.
Okay.
So.
Why is it there's always a lot of focus on the years at university and learning when I find most of your learning is after you've been to uni? You just go there for your degree as quick as you can and you get out and the real life begins. So many times we're now seeing politicians have no idea of science. They're making wrong decisions on NBN, the energy. Our graduates are being overlooked. They're not learning how to promote themselves properly. It's really sad because they look at a book, they're really good at studying, but they don't know how to negotiate to the top.
Yes, look, I think that's true, and obviously people need to learn throughout their lives. Kristen and I were talking about this before. I think we have some problems with the school system and the way people learn and whether that is applicable to when they leave the education. And we probably have problems with the universities as well. So questions about how we're teaching students at university, whether they're being taught well, whether they're being taught to think. But absolutely, people need to, I balk at any teaching cliches, but lifelong learning is one that springs to mind, that people need to be able to keep learning throughout their lives.
Thanks, Cathy. And I just wanted to engage with you on your claim or your opinion that research-led teaching is what was the adjective you used?
Conversations with colleagues.
No. I think you said, I think it's bunkum, nonsense or something.
Oh, no, not research, no.
The teaching is,
the claim
it's important to have a connection between research and teaching.
You can't teach well unless you do research. Right. That's the thing I said was rubbish, that you cannot teach well unless you do research. Right. That's what I don't agree with.
So I guess this might not, it's in a sideways engagement with that point, and really it's just a comment, because I think it's not that I'm not convinced by your point, and it was valuable for me to listen to you put it in the way that you did, but I think it gets at the issue from the point of view of the individual and the experience in the classroom, which you described really beautifully. But I just wanted to go back to what I think is an important connection between research and teaching, and something that it is, I'm trying to think how to express this, because it's come to me listening to you rather than having been a formulated thought, but it's structurally valuable to have that connection. And I think the reason it's so often repeated and that it has been taken as a truism to some extent is because actually people don't mean to focus on the individual experience so much as to retain the independence of universities as an autonomous institution from politics. That's what and I know maybe this is a different point that's not relevant to your talk, but I just am feeling it's really relevant right now because there was an MP in London, one of the Tories has just requested that all European Union teachers pass on copies of their syllabus and what they're teaching their students about Brexit.
Oh, yes, yeah.
And, you know, I know that's a completely different thing, but there's something really important that we remember that, you know, because our research is got this kind of cultural commitment to independence from politics, and that we feed that into our teaching, and that as a structural institution that we retain that independence. And I just wanted to speak to that.
Look, I think that I don't for a moment think that research doesn't matter. And for example, I don't know that you can supervise, obviously, research essays or research degrees if you don't do research yourself. I mean, in that sense, it's absolutely essential. I just mean that the mantra that you can't teach well unless you research means that universities have lost literally thousands of outstanding teachers. So I've watched UNSW lose teacher after teacher after teacher who is employed as a sessional staff member, who is an outstanding teacher. They're really doing a really significant part of the job incredibly well. But because they don't do research, and typically because they actually haven't even had a chance to do it, they haven't had an opportunity, they will never ever get a job. And we've lost them. I've been here a long time. I've watched, I could name countless teachers. I could also name permanent members of staff who've lost their jobs because they don't do research, despite the fact that they have taught students amazingly for decades and are doing something that other colleagues cannot do. So literally cannot do, are not able, for example, to explain things in a way that some of these people are able to do. So it's not to say that research doesn't matter, it's just not the case that research is essential to all teaching, because it's not. A lot of what we're teaching has nothing to do with what we research. Andrew.
Cathy, thanks for your presentation. I suppose my question is really to shift your focus just a little bit away from the individual. So you've talked about recognising individual good teachers or great teachers, but I know that you're a member of the Scientia Education Academy, and so I suppose rather than just recognising individuals teaching to the same degree in which we recognise individual research achievements, I wonder what you might be able to say more about creating a community of teaching, and rather than, I agree with you about innate qualities that individuals have, and you don't learn perhaps to be a great teacher, but you do certainly absorb a lot from the practices of colleagues and sharing of information. I mean, we're all here doing this right now in many ways, so I just wanted to push you a little bit more towards the more communal aspect of creating an environment in which teachers exchange ideas, and certainly if they don't learn from each other, they grow from hearing about what each other does. So rather than being so focused on the individual.
Yep, I would absolutely agree with that, but I'd say it's just like research. We learn from each other as researchers. That's why we go to conferences. It's why we talk to colleagues. We learn from a community of researchers, but we also do individual research for which we are credited. And I would say teaching is exactly the same. It is a communal activity. And I've got to say, the Scientia Education Academy, I mean, when I start, I think throughout the year we've all been a bit like, what are we doing here? What's this about? But the one thing I can say absolutely definitely is they are a fantastic bunch of people. And I don't say this in a kind of, this is not spruiking the academy. It has been an incredible opportunity to work with other people who are amazing teachers, and yes, to learn from them. So I think without a doubt we do learn, and that's important that we have a community, but I don't see why teaching should be any different to research. Nobody expects research simply to be a communal activity.
Oh, thank you. My question is in a similar vein.
This is my daughter, everyone.
But it's a serious question. So I know that you didn't seek out to define or describe great teaching, but you did make a few comments on it. And to me, I have to say that it sounded like you were weighting communication skills very heavily in terms of what great teaching is. And I have to say, in my experience as a student, great teaching takes many different forms and not just communication skills. And definitely some teachers excel in that area, but other teachers excel in other places. And in terms of learning, a lot of learning occurs not just as a result of that stand and deliver style of lecturing. And I also think in terms of how institutions are going to promote great teaching, I'm not sure how helpful it is to have such a perhaps limited view of what great teaching is. So I'm wondering what your perspective is on the other things that contribute to great teaching and what role they might play in promoting better teaching on an institutional level.
Yep, okay, thank you. So you can see we have a lot of conversations about teaching in our, what was that, Brooke? Well, I would actually say, I come from a long line. My mother is here. She's a teacher. My mother was an academic at the University of Queensland for many years and is an amazing teacher of Paradise Lost, which is a very complicated poem. And Emily has just got into the Teach for Australia program. She's going to be a teacher in Melbourne, and her partner Brendan is also a teacher, so there's a lot of teachers in our family. We spend a lot of time talking about it. So yes, absolutely, without a doubt. It's one element of teaching, and I think there are other elements of teaching that are incredibly important. Things like feedback. I really am kind of neurotic about teaching jargon, but like feedback on essays, and not just writing good, tick, there's 67%. That's incredibly distressing for students to not get good feedback or know what they've done. So taking the time to do that kind of stuff, I think, really matters. And I know that a lot of classes, so for example in arts faculties you won't have a lot of lecturing, or I try not to lecture in law, we don't do lecturing, but very often at university there are just complex things that you want someone to be able to understand. So whether it's philosophy, whether it's engineering, science, law, you actually do want someone to be able to say, and it doesn't have to be, like I said, we don't have lectures in law, we have seminars. You really do want someone who can explain complex concepts comprehensibly, because that really is a really core value in universities. But I absolutely agree with you. I think there are other things that make up good teaching. And so when I started with good teaching, I didn't mean to be dismissive of those things. I think they're really, really important. And I think great teachers, having said that teachers are not necessarily meant to be students' friends, I do think that teachers most certainly need to care about students and care about giving feedback.
Can I ask just a quick follow-up question?
Louise? Oh no, the question's coming thick and fast now. Maybe you should be able to put that up on your website. Goodness. I think at that point I wouldn't be able to compete with you, Louise, though, because you probably teach about 2,000 students in 2 years, I imagine, I'm guessing. Look, I think that what it comes back to is what I was saying, that teaching is really personal. I think it's personal in a way that research isn't. So it really is about standing up in front of people and being judged, and I think that that's why people are much, much more circumspect about being upfront about teaching. I do also think that there is a thing, well, anyone can teach, but I also think there really is a profound lack of recognition that the ability to teach well is it is a skill. It's not an accident. It's, yeah. Yeah. Yep. Yep. And I think like everything in life, success is a combination of two things. One is hard work and one is innate ability. You won't get far if you only have one but not the other. And teaching is one of those things. You can work at it to a certain extent, but people have different abilities, and that's okay. I just think the thing is with teaching institutions, you want to make sure that the people who are teaching, not necessarily all of your staff, but the people who are teaching are at the other end of the spectrum, because that's what will benefit students.
Why aren't those great great sessional teachers named and celebrated. What's there some kind of anonymity there at UNSW?
Oh, I think it's, I think maybe, look, I don't know, it's certainly under the union agreement. Maybe it wasn't like that when you were at UQ, but we're just not open about it. We don't talk about who are, there are teaching awards and things like that, but like I said, I'm a little bit sceptical about them. So it's part of the culture.
The highest one got nearly 100%. She talked, you talked about communal conversations with colleagues. Is there a community of these sessional teachers too?
Yes, there is. There is.
Can they tell one another?
Yeah, no, there is. But I think very often I've got a number of colleagues who are in the room at the moment. I don't have the faintest idea what their teaching scores are, and I've worked with them for decades. And if they're not great teaching scores, that's okay. I'm happy with that. I don't need to know. But if they're fantastic teaching scores, I think that's really sad, that I actually don't have any idea. I've got strong suspicions about my colleagues, some of my colleagues who are in the room, who I know are really outstanding teachers. I'm looking at them, I know who they are, but I don't really know, I'm just guessing. I actually have no idea. I really have no idea. Michelle, sorry.
Hi, Cathy, thanks. One of the themes that hasn't quite come into your lecture, but I've been thinking about as you were talking, is the role of risk-taking in the kind of the processes of a good teacher. So sometimes what makes us great teachers is that we're willing to try something different that might actually fail and may actually cause some of those scores to temporarily drop. And I think it's actually something really important, and I think that one thing that the institution needs to do is to encourage us to take some of those risks and be prepared to support us if it doesn't go so well.
Absolutely, Michelle. I completely agree. So people do have to take risks, and I took a very big risk about a year ago, introducing a closed book exam in a faculty that's never had them. So without a doubt, and that can affect people's teaching assessments. So I'm talking about over the long term. So that you try things and you can point to say, I tried something and it didn't work, or students didn't like it. But I mean, consistently over the course of 5-10 years, people saying, well, there's always a reason. I'm taking risks. Students never like it. I'm not convinced about that. You've got 10 years of students telling you that they don't like what you're doing. I think you need to have a really serious hard think about what you're doing. And it's really disrespectful to students to say, well, all of those students, hundreds and hundreds of them, they're all wrong and I'm right. Again, I hate teaching cliches, but respecting students, being serious about what they're saying. The odd dip, fine. 10 years? No, not okay. Yes?
Kia ora, Cathy. I'm a final year PhD student at the end of my 4th year. And I guess my experience has been one where you see a sort of, like you mentioned, I think a culture where research is very much held up as the big thing. So I'm wondering, not to put you on the spot too much, but if you have any bits of advice for how PhD students or even early career researchers can kind of efforts they can take to move the dial back a bit to a point where I guess we're in a culture where teaching and research are equally valued.
I think it's very hard for junior members of staff or PhD students. I do honestly think that UNSW has done something very good by introducing education-focused roles. So like I said, they've been on the cards for decades and people were really nervous about them for good reason. I think people were legitimately scared of them because I've listened to universities talk for decades about how they're going to value teaching and they haven't. So I think people were genuinely scared about what it would mean, and hopefully it'll be all right for us. We'll all still be here in 2 years or 5 years' time. But I think that's a huge step forward. So having education-focused roles. So I think that's a really good thing that UNSW's done. I think the reality is it's incredibly hard for PhD students and junior members of staff in the same way that it is for sessional members of staff. They just have to take it as it is and they don't have any control over it, they can't change it. And eventually what happens to sessional members of staff is most of them end up leaving. They will go and get a permanent job somewhere else because they can't stick it out for, 5 years or more with incredibly erratic casual employment. So I'm sorry, that's probably not very helpful. Don?
Thanks, Cathy. Yeah, really interesting to hear your ideas there. A couple of things. One thing is actually using the term teaching. Like, I find that most people either don't call themselves teachers or students don't say teachers, they're lecturers or tutors. Yep. I think that makes a big difference, actually. The second point is, I suppose, to go back to the beginning point, one thing that's always worried me is when you start teaching. What happens is, oh, here's your classroom. This is where you start, here's the textbook. If you're lucky, you might get more than 3 days to prepare. But at that starting point, I think, for a lot of people, trying to work out the art in the craft of teaching, which I think is the most difficult. And I often think about this. If you teach early childhood, you need 4 years. If you teach primary, secondary, you need so many years of training. You teach at university, not 1 hour of training do you need to actually start. I would make it compulsory, to be quite honest, because that shows we take it seriously. If it's not compulsory and people can start, it's like, don't take it seriously, just, off you go. What do you think?
I think it's interesting. I think we definitely should be providing people with some kind of training. I would be really disturbed if we ended up saying that university lecturers have to have a teaching qualification, because I think there is ample evidence of incredibly good teaching all across the university sector, and almost none of us have a qualification. And I think we've all been at high school, we've all been taught by people, every single one of whom was qualified to teach, and not every single one of whom was a good teacher. So while I think, and I'm not suggesting that high school and primary school teachers shouldn't be qualified, I'm not saying that for a moment, but I would be very disturbed if we saw compulsory degrees for higher education, because I'm not sure that you need them to be a good teacher. But certainly guidance, so courses and stuff. So when I started at the age of 24, it was, there's a classroom, off you go and teach. I suspect that's not a good idea. I think pointing out some really obvious, instead of making people reinvent the wheel and work things out for themselves, which they might work out in a year's time or 5 years' time, or they may never work out, yes, absolutely, we should be providing people with some kind of guidance and training on teaching. And I absolutely agree with you about talking about the word teaching. So I'm kind of really often worried about that kind of amorphous teaching and learning thing. It's not the act of teaching.
So just before you do that, in terms of UNSW, from next year it will be mandatory for all teaching staff on contracts longer than 12 months to do the foundations of university level teaching.
Brenton?
So first thing, maybe just a comment on that. I feel like, I've just graduated my Master of Teaching like a few days ago. And a comment on that is that I found my experience learning to teach, you could call it, didn't come until I entered the classroom and started figuring it out for myself. We had 9 months before we did that, and we heard teaching is problematic and we can't teach you how to teach. And then we learnt that we didn't learn anything about teaching until we started teaching. I don't know, that's just a comment. I don't know if I've got anything more to say on it.
Yeah. Well.
A question separate to that is, how much of an opportunity do lecturers and academics have to observe what good teaching is among their peers? 100%, 97, and a bottom of 97% is all good and well, but that's just a number. Given that teaching is so personal, what does that look like in the classroom?
Well, we do. So we have opportunities for peer review. So people to, there are classes that people can go and watch teach. So, people are asked, are you happy for people to come and watch your class? And the answer is yes. So we do that opportunity. Often it's a question of time whether people do it. But yes, certainly that's something that certainly didn't exist when I first started teaching. You could do it, voluntarily. You could ask people. I remember sitting in on one of my colleagues' classes. She was lovely. And I learnt some things from her. When a student asked a question, made a comment, she said, "You might think that's insightful, Mr. Jones, but I don't." I learnt quite a bit watching her teaching. But it's been formalised in universities now, and I think that that's a very good thing to help people, because I think that, it's good. It's good to watch people teach. I think you can learn things from watching people teach. Richard?
I just snuck in. Thank you, Cathy. That was lovely. A comment and a question, if I can squeeze that in. First of all, just your observation about the importance of teaching and education beyond university. I think that's absolutely true, that for our whole life we should be learning. It's sort of crazy. We say this is a period you learn, this is a period you don't. And I guess we're now concerned about the learning and teaching at university, but absolutely the learning and teaching before and after that are equally important. And you said the government's not so interested in it, but that's not true, because the Minister for Education has funded Education to the Node, which is where a whole lot of money have been put aside for education, and it funds an enormous bureaucracy. It stops slightly before it gets to the teachers. But so that was my comment. And yes, absolutely. Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think at university we're part of a big picture. And the question was, thank you, Jeff. Cathy, I think the best thing you've done is your family. I'm amazed by their questions. Well
My husband's looking really happy. He's not a teacher. Smile, Roddy.
I think that that what you're talking about here is sort of a minimum. Is this right? I'd like to hear your thoughts. You're talking about teaching evaluations and scores, and we all know that's not the whole story, but I think you're saying it's ridiculous to ignore it. At a minimum, we need to look and pay attention to it. And you're talking about teaching as explaining, and again, at a minimum, you should be able to teach. But certainly, I sort of like what your daughter said. I think teaching is also more than explaining, and ultimately it's how we change someone as a person over the 4 or 5 years or 3 years they're with us. And part of that's explaining, and part of that's creating cultures and communities and supporting them in various ways and motivating them. So do you have any other thoughts about what more great teaching could be? I know it's indefinable, but what are these other elements that we should tease out in the way you've explained explaining so well?
Look, I think there's lots of things. I mean, I think being, actually caring about students, talking to them, making an effort to talk to students, I think all of those things. But I would go back to saying that I don't think that student assessments are the be-all and end-all, but I think they are much, much more important than we give them credit for, because it's what students think. And they're the people being taught, and they know whether they have learned. I think there are all sorts of other things. I think people will provide various levels of care to students. So there are people who, just by virtue of being an extrovert, are quite happy to talk to students till the cows come home. Come to my office and I'll chat to you. That's, I'm happy to do that. Talk to you about your life, what you're going to do, what you're going to do with your career. I think all of those things are really important and we can influence people. A lot of people don't want to do that, but I would still go back to the fact that if we ask students what really matters to you, it's fronting up to a lecture or to a classroom and having to listen to someone for an hour or 2 hours and wanting what they're saying to be comprehensible and to teach them something that they could not learn on their own. I think that is, really probably the most important thing to students. There are lots of other things that are important, but if there's a single important thing, it's that a classroom is comprehensible and people learn something.
Absolutely. Thank you.
So let's thank Cathy for a wonderful...